very fancy piece of equipment is the microphone. So hopefully you can all hear me. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Logan, and I'm the Chief Commissioner in the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. And I've been very kindly asked by the Law Centre to chair the session for me this morning. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Eilionóir Flynn. Eilionóir will be known to all of you. Eilionóir is the Deputy Director of the Centre, and there is in this lovely booklet a very fine dialogue of all of the speakers this morning. So what I am going to do, just for the benefit of the whole audience, is just give you a little very small intro, and we can move into all of the information in the booklet. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm really pleased to see some very familiar faces in the crowd, and also to see some new people that I haven't met before. I'm also pleased to welcome our international visitors, and we're very glad that you can be with us today. So I'm just going to say a few brief words before handing over to our first really exciting set of presenters. I want to tell you a little bit about how I came up with the idea for this project, and we'll hear more about what the project is about later on. So when I started to think about what a project on human capacity would look like, I was finding myself a little bit frustrated at some of the conferences and meetings that I was going to, where I felt that there was a very small group of people talking mostly to each other, often agreeing, and not getting beyond some of the general principles that we all agree with, that every human being should have a right, by virtue of being born, to be equally recognised as a person before the law, that all adults should have the same rights to make decisions and choices that are respected by the law. And we weren't getting to the heart of some of the trickier issues, like when should the state intervene if a person is in danger? How can we do that in a way that's protective of all of the person's human rights and doesn't in fact marginalise them or coerce them in a way that would violate their human rights? And the little glimmers of hope that I had in these conversations were mostly coming from when I was speaking with people with disabilities themselves, and I feel that that's where the really valuable knowledge and wisdom is, and that's where we can all learn about what the law should look like and what solutions actually work in the real lives of real people. So that's why I wanted to bring this group of people together today, and I'm really proud to have the lineup that we have today. I had to pinch myself every time I read the programme to make sure that these people all really did agree to come to Dublin and to have this conversation that we're going to have today. I think we have such a great collection of people. We've got dreamers and thinkers and doers and troublemakers and artists and activists and teachers and students, and sometimes one person is all of these things. So I think I'm really excited about the conversations that we're going to have. Before we go into the first set of presentations, I just wanted to reflect on a quote that really strikes home to me, which is from the Nigerian writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She says that the way in which stories are told is really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. So I think today we're going to hear very many first-person stories in people's own words, and we're going to work together, I hope, to tell throughout this project as many different stories as we can about people with disabilities and about their human rights. And I'll just end with one other final quote from Cormac Russell, who's a community development organiser, and he says that change happens when we have new stories about what is possible. So I hope that we will have those new stories today, and we will start to create change together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eilionóir. I think that's a lovely introduction to describe us as dreamers, thinkers, troublemakers, and sometimes how that can all be in one person. Our next speaker is Gombos. Gábor is a world-renowned independent disability rights defender, and his work and activism over the past 2 decades has ranged from grassroots peer support by users and survivors of psychiatry through national, international, regional and non-governmental organisations, right up to and including the United Nations. And we're going to sit through the presentation. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Madam Chair. It's a real privilege for me to be here in Dublin in this winter morning. And let me at the very outset apologize that I'm not going to be as good as I would like to be. I am a person with what we call psychosocial disability. At the age of 16, I was diagnosed by a major mental disorder, and at the very same time I was fortunate enough to have an education to become a physicist, to do research, which kept me more or less part of a small community of thinkers. But I have been in psychiatry without my consent or against my declared will several times in my life. But actually my story started much earlier. My mother was forcibly taken to a psychiatric hospital when I was 3. And one of my first direct memories is not even about the way she was forcibly admitted, taken away from home, but when half a year later she was discharged and she returned. At that time, the choice of treatment for almost all mental disorders was electroshock. It's not past, still electroshock is being done in most parts of the world. Now, one of the now well-known side effects or long-term consequences of electroshock is memory loss. My mother did not remember after her discharge from the hospital the most elementary things, which was at the very heart of the life of a 3-year-old boy. I simply could not believe that she was my mother. How could she be if she didn't remember the most basic things, what happened, what had happened to her before she ended up in the hospital. And then, throughout her life, she was part of the revolving door system, meaning that she was most of the time, against her will, admitted to the hospital, spent some time there, then was discharged. She was with us, she tried to work, she tried to be a mother, etc., etc., without receiving any substantive support to exercise on those societal roles. So gradually she became a person who lived on, if you can live on, a disability pension. Obviously you cannot. She lost most of her acknowledged societal roles. Even her parental role was at stake all the time. At any time, authorities could declare upon her mental disorder that she was not fit to exercise as a mother, which again has impact on her as well as on me. So I just wanted to give you, the background in which I became gradually involved in this work on the rights of persons who were diagnosed with a mental disorder. Increasingly, we identify this issue as not an illness issue, not a medical issue primarily, but a particular issue. We are somewhat different, or we are seen as such, and the response from society is to this difference, to this diversity, is exclusion. And there are many ways to exclude people. Typically, they happen through negative attitudes. But when we talk about negative attitudes, in this particular field we are talking today, we are not talking only about emotional prejudice-based behaviors. We are talking about laws. We are talking about norms which rule how our societies work at large and how they work in relation to people who are seen different because either of a mental disorder, which we in this context call psychosocial disability, or a learning disability, intellectual disability, or any other related issue. And the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities basically just gave that very basic level recognition that societies have to face one very simple question, in my opinion. They either really and seriously and genuinely acknowledge and commit themselves accordingly to see us as persons, as human beings, or clearly say that no. Within this family of humanity, there are persons, and there are some others who look like people, but actually who are somewhat less than human. But what no longer can be done, in my opinion, is to pretend that, oh yeah, we are full persons with the same human rights as anybody else, and then doing the opposite. I have been asked to lecture and consult and advise on this issue which is called legal capacity. And I have tried to approach this from many different angles because I find it very boring to repeat the same thing twice. I hope I am saying the same message every time, but I'm trying to explore how to elaborate on this issue. Very often, when I listen to others or I watch the video on which I am lecturing, I have this feeling that, oh shit, is it really just such a complex concept? You can read articles, papers, you can hear discussions around legal capacity, and after 5 minutes, I frankly often get lost. Because they use technical terms, I have no idea what they are talking about. All the subtleties of law come and play a role in the game, and I no longer see where the person is. In my opinion, human rights is partly about law, and we have to take law seriously because, as I have already said, law can be the most powerful way to either oppress people, and what old legal regimes have been doing in the world around this legal capacity, and I will try to tell you in a minute what simple this concept actually is, or it can be the greatest enabler for social justice. And in my opinion, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities as a whole, and one of its articles, which is the famous Article 12, which is about legal capacity, aims at this enabling role, aims at serving justice for groups of people who have been treated very unfairly and less than humanly throughout thousands of years of history. So what is this mysterious idea of legal capacity? First of all, the conventions say that all persons with disabilities, as any other person, are persons. It sounds very simple, but what really this person would mean? And again, you can read philosophical literature around it, technical legal literature. I am trying to put it in a very simple human context. And this is my understanding. This is not the authoritative opinion of anyone. Also, I think it is based by some existing documents which were adopted by the United Nations body, which has the mandate to interpret the convention authoritatively. The rest of the text of Article 12 of this convention elaborates on several of the key elements of this personhood. But what does it mean that I am a person? What does it mean that I am not an object? For me as a physicist, one of the major differences is that I am unique. A piece of stone, well, to some extent you may say it's also unique, and there are no two identical pieces of stone, but the differences are not really significant. at least that is the mainstream cultural opinion on that. If you go to the level of electrons, sorry that the physicist me is still here, then what our 20th century understanding, revolutionary understanding about electrons, was that all the electrons are identical. There are absolutely no way to say which is electron A and which is electron B. The more closer we come to a human person, the more uniqueness you discover and acknowledge. So personhood for me has this very basic meaning and message that I am only in this unique body, with this unique mind, with all the goods and bads which are located within me, and in my interactions with the world. And all these complex sounding things make me, for society, as a very important environmental factor, including law is a very powerful instrument, make me the unique being who cannot be replaced by anybody else. And it's true for all of you, all of us. I believe this is what the convention recognized. And still, this is not the opinion which really penetrates through our policies, through our laws, through the way how we provide services for people with either psychosocial disabilities or people with intellectual disabilities and people with any kind of disabilities. The fact that I am a person also means more than just I have this unique identity. I also have an agency. What does it mean? It means that I am not a passive object of other people's good or bad wills. It is me who is born with views and preferences. And maybe other people see my situation sometimes better than myself. My dignity really means that I have the right to make even wrong choices. It is not an imagined best interest, what is in my best interest, what should lead my existence in this world, including my interactions with others and others' interactions with me. And when I'm talking about others, I mean other people, but also social institutions. For historically long periods of time, certain groups of people were, or at least could be, deprived of this agency. You know, up to now, in several countries, women face this very strange situation that upon majority, they resume a certain range of agency. They can dispose over their property. As soon as they get married, they lose that agency. It is going to be the husband who will take up that responsibility. So it is not only persons with disabilities in general, persons with intellectual or psychosocial disabilities in particular, who face this challenge of losing the recognition of our agency, losing it through the law. It's not just disregarding, I wouldn't say it is a legal disqualification from the recognition of my agency. And that, in my very simple opinion, really means that as long as such approaches prevail, we are not treated as full persons. Because instead of being our active guardians for ourselves, some others are or can be appointed as guardians for us to make decisions for us in our supposed best interest. And simply, that is not the way how human beings operate in general. So when the Convention does recognize that all persons with disabilities, regardless our cleverness or the lack of it, who decides what is cleverness and what is not. Regardless of any other contingency, just because we were born humans, and as Eilionóir said, we do have this right to actively become the agents in our lives and interact with other equal agents. Now, some people, when first hear about this new approach to legal capacity, ask this question, whether you disregard that people with disabilities do have impairments. Do you deny that there are people who cannot make legally binding, important, grave decisions on their own? Now, in the end of the day, I think again, this dividing the universe into us and them is very much there, and we should go beyond that for a moment. I think every human being, before making an important, grave decision, consults other people, talk to other people. It's not easy to make those decisions for anybody. Especially if we come to, for instance, the question of giving consent to medical treatment, which is, my understanding, an important piece in this project. You know, this very highly technological medicine, with a very sophisticated biotechnological and other knowledge which was gathered in the science of medicine. An average person, when faces a question, you know, I have various questions regarding my health condition, what should I decide? How competent they really are in this decision. And then in the end of the day, when you are to make this decision, regardless whether you have a disability or not, and if yes, what kind of disability you have, the ultimate decision will be a very tricky thing. And very often will not be based on strictly rational, evidence-based consideration. And modern societies do increasingly recognize that a cancer patient has the right to say no to the offered treatment. Because simply there is no objective standard based on which, you know, there is a best interest for a cancer patient. Nobody can make this judgment, because actually it's a judgment. You know, what quality of life you can accept for yourself as a human until when you want to comply with what kind of treatment. Now, when it comes to people with psychosocial disabilities and intellectual disabilities, most of the legal regimes across this globe give legal ways to ignore the person's will and preferences regarding at least some kinds of medical treatment, and treatment can be imposed on us not only in the absence of our consent, but also against the express will of us. So there is this two-sided, two-faced approach to us regarding, for instance, the consent to medical. But going back to this question, whether those of us who were working very hard in the negotiations of the convention on how legal capacity should be reflected in this legally binding instrument, are we so naive that we deny that some people with disabilities may find decision-making situations difficult for us? No, the answer is that we just acknowledge that this is the human condition. There are some tough decisions. What is tough for me is not necessarily tough for you, vice versa. But there are decisions for each of us where we may want to use support. Now what happens again is that if a white, upper middle class male, before making a business decision, consults friends and colleagues, that is seen as a wise thing to do. They use support. They ask friends, partners, maybe they pay for advice to consulting companies, and it's seen by society as a wise thing to do. Well, now, if you are a person with psychosocial disability, or you are a person with intellectual disability, and people around you see that you are seeking, sometimes desperately seeking support for your decision making, then society sees this seeking support as an indicator that your legal capacity may be affected. It would be better for you to be deprived of your legal capacity and the guardian be appointed for you to make decisions for you. Again, these very different approaches depending on whether the person who needs support is a person with disability or not. What Article 12 of the Convention basically says regarding the support is two things. The states who ratify this convention has a duty to ensure, to make arrangements that people with disabilities, when they want to use support to make legally binding choices, have an access to this support. The other thing is that if I am using support in exercising my legal capacity, if I want to use the technical terms, making important and legally or financially binding decisions, then I have a right to do so. And my legal capacity shall never be questioned based on this ground, or based on any other disability. What really happens very often in societies' differing attitudes to people without disability and people with disabilities in relation to our legal capacity is that our entire systems of law and mental health messed up the things, and they mixed up two absolutely unrelated ideas. One, what they call mental capacity, and the UK was the first country which came out with very sophisticated mental capacity legislation, and then other English-speaking countries followed them. And I would say that there is a huge industry, medical legal industry, and services industry is built upon this concept, very sophisticated, I have to acknowledge, concept on mental capacity, which in fact does not mean mental capacity. Most of the time it means mental incapacity. What the authoritative interpretation of Article 12 says about this aspect is that mental capacity has nothing to do with legal capacity. Legal capacity is not something you test. Legal capacity is something which you have. And support must be given to you if you want to enable you to exercise this legal capacity. Mental capacity is basically a scientific construct, which tries to test, to measure your different cognitive skills. Now, the convention approach is different. It does say that those who have better cognitive skills and faculties, whatever it means, are not better or more full persons as humans than those who have less fortunate or less successful cognitive skills. Let alone that past decades discoveries in psychology as well as in neurosciences, surprisingly, really demonstrate that very little of our real decision making is done through primarily cognitive functioning. Most of our decision makings are based on, and Freud already knew this, on absolutely unrelated non-cognitive procedures. And nobody can test those hypotheses which are equally relevant in decision making. The convention also acknowledges that there are some areas where people with disabilities in general, people with psychosocial disabilities and intellectual disabilities in particular, often denied our agency, our active role, being our own guardians. One of these areas is finances and money. In several countries, there is only a very limited understanding of guardianship, mandating the agency role to somebody else to decide for you in your best interest, namely on financial issues. And I have to acknowledge that I myself find financial decisions in my life particularly challenging. The area where I use most support in my decisions is the area of finances. Now the Convention again makes clear that even finances, as an important and delicate area, there is no justification to question and deny a person's living capacity on the ground of our disabilities or supposed limitations in our mental capacities, whatever those capacities exactly mean. Now, a bunch of other questions raise. For instance, how to prevent abuse. People with disabilities may be put in particularly vulnerable situations. We hear, in many societies that older people, lonely people, people with disabilities, and people coming from any other vulnerable positions are often abused. I mean, they easily find themselves end up in the streets as homeless people. And in a sense, the deprivation of legal capacity, placement under guardianship is a very convenient, I would say a suspiciously too overly convenient way to protect us. If you look into the documents, then I would say the picture is somewhat different, because what interests and whose interests are protected through the system is a highly non-trivial. Very delicate power situations are at play. And if we accept, that the entire process and the motivation to protect us came from the observation that we were in a more vulnerable situation than the one who is on the other side and who may appoint it to me as a guardian, it's not an equal power. Now, taking away, even legally and formally, my agency in this already unjust situation makes me even more vulnerable. To the extent, that the end may be a long-term institutional placement. I find myself in a long-term institution under conditions which easily may amount to torture. And I feel so privileged that one of my distinguished respondents will be my old hero, Mr. Rusi Stanev, who can talk about such experiences in the first person. So what is at stake is not just, a technicality. What is at stake is our humanity, including our freedom from torture and other basic, very, very elementary human rights things. My final short submission is that sometimes I hear from friends and colleagues, especially from developing countries, that this idea of legal capacity in the convention is a very Nordic one. Emphasizes, autonomy of the person, emphasizes the person's self-determination, which is a very Nordic concept. I'm not sure how Nordic concept actually it is, frankly. That's one observation. But the other thing is that through the recognition of the duty of the state to provide access, to ensure access to support, then I want to use support to exercise my legal capacity, and also my right to use my existing support, really reflect a huge deviation from the earlier human rights instruments, earlier human rights conventions. The old ones, especially the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, I agree, comes with an image of a human being who is primarily white, upper middle class, and male. And differing on your culture, the religion may also be physical. People who can withdraw to their ivory tower autonomously, independently, cut out from the rest of the world, think, and come out with wise decisions. But most of us, most of the times throughout our life, including childhood and older ages, and if we are of other gender, for instance, than the preferred one, our realities are very different. If we are people with disabilities, our realities are very different. We really understand that human existence happens in an interdependent manner. And I do think that the way how the convention deals with legal capacity is a good attempt to cover both interdependence and independence of the person. And there is another important article in this convention, Article 19, which is an elaboration of the right to live independently and to be included in the community, which further elaborates, very much based on what the convention says in Article 12 about legal capacity, on this second element of human existence, namely that I, as a person, want to be and have a right to be a full and equal part of the communities which are given to me and which are chosen by me. If we have some short time for urgent questions and answers, then I'm happy.
I think Gábor, thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful. You speak so eloquently, and I think the fact that you're a physicist actually makes it even more interesting. And to be able to do that without any notes, so you can't see from your notes, but there are notes in front of you, so that was really, really amazing. What we had planned, the instruction I've been given, is to hear from everybody, if you don't mind, and then we have questions and answers for 15 minutes at the end, and then that's followed by tea or coffee, so that if you don't feel comfortable to ask a question in the group, that you can talk to people on a one-to-one basis. Is that okay? So we will have another time after this. Our next speaker is a hero of many people in this room, Rusi Stanev, who is a plaintiff in the landmark judgment of the European Court of Human Rights on Stanev and Logan. And we're going to hear from Rusi in his own words.
Дневну работу чрез семейство в Болгария grew up in poor family of workers, and we lived in town of Rusi in Bulgaria, close to river Dunaj.
Завършил съм основно образование.
I finished. I didn't finish full education. I finished just part of my education.
И нямах възможност да уча повече и баща ми ме взема в завода за работа, където работа като локомотивен завод, ремонт на локомотивен.
I had not possibility to finish my education, and before that my father took me in his working quarters, and I became a worker.
Работих като слосен монтьор и студара работих една година.
That one was explained what exactly he worked, but I cannot explain this. I'm sorry, it's very technical. It's some not very, not very good qualification.
Общо каквито ми разрешени работи. Там ми се това заминах за София, където живееш в истинската ми майка и почнах работа по металогичния комбинат Кeynote.
Then I went in Sofia when my real mother lived. And I started working another factory. I will not hear something by myself because I know the story very well. This family story is very complicated, and he grew up with his stepmother. So because of that, he told you that he started with her real mother. Sorry for that.
Работих една година и половина и получих нервна криза в София и след като бях настанен в психиатрията.
I worked for 1.5 years in Sofia, and then I had crisis, and I was placed in psychiatric hospital.
В София видях 6 месеца в психиатрията, след като се възстанових, се върнах в град Руси, отново започнах работа в локомотивния завод в Варшава. Само че бях обща работа.
I was in the psychiatric hospital for 6 months, and after that I went in my town Rusi again and started to work with my father again in a very low-paid work.
Работих като работих някъде близо една година и можех да, тъй като бях физически слаб, и можех да издържам на чума и 8 часов работен ден тежък труд. Влизах в психиатрията, където имаше дневен стационар, бях открили в град Руси. До обед ходихме там, след обед сортирахме по къщите.
Next 1 year I spent trying to work with my father, but it was very difficult for me because I was physically not very strong. It was very difficult for me. So I went in the psychiatric hospital again. There was daycare, and I spent the half of the day in the psychiatric, and then I went in my home. This was for 1 year.
Дневен стационар ми плащаха болнични по 1-2 месеца, всяки там ми плащаха болнични. В завода, където работи в локомотивния завод, и после се връщат на работа.
I had in that time health insurance, and they paid me for this period in the hospital. So I spent this was period in which I spent 2 months in the hospital, and after that I went in my workplace again, and after that again in the hospital.
В период на 4-5 месеца, като работя, пак влизах в болница 1-2 месеца.
It's the same, the period prolonged.
И лекарите казаха, ако искате да пенсионираме,
And then the doctors offered me pension, and I was agreed.
и след като ме пенсионираха, там в русската град, руската психиатрията имаше фототерапия, където работи ми правят и се то ресурсирахме. Бяхме добре заплатени, вземахме по 70-80 лева заплата. Обработилно се, което работи. В 2004 години.
In the next 4 or 5 years, I received my pension, and I went in psychiatry when there is some kind of labor therapy where I had some kind of work, and I received 78 leva per month, which is my note, which is around 40 euro per month.
И пенсията, която взема, и заплатата, понеже живота беше по-ефтин в България, и аз живеех с баба си и 2 стаи. Имах къща на баща ми, понеже имам първа майка и баба ми живееше при мен, тя много ме обича.
In that time, I share my property. I had 2 rooms in that time in the yard of my other property. So I lived there with my grandmother, who loved me very much.
След като баба ми почина 1984 година, аз останах само в тях стаи да живея и лекарката, която беше началник в цял комисията, каза, просто искаш да направим първа група без придружител, понеже останаш сам и нямаше да имаш пари, с които да се прехранват. Не се увеличи малко пенсия. Бях с 80.
Then in 84, my grandmother passed away. And then the psychiatrist offered me to go to commission, expert commission, to receive which will prove that I'm more disabled than until this moment. Because as she explained me, I will receive bigger pension.
Макар и съм личен каса, полет на работа, вземах пенсия, почнах да си ползвам, справях с живота добре.
Even alone, I was able to take care of myself.
дирекции, дирекции, бордовици, учества.
I cleaned my home, I cooked for myself.
И баща ми почина на 98 година и втората е майка и сестра, родената ми сестра, гледаха да отърват от мене, понеже в тях стаи нямало документ за стаите, и за да живее, гледаха да ме изгонят. И ма поставяха 2000 година под запрещение. Чрез съда 4 дела водиха по лятото на 2000 година. Съдийка трябва да съдима, но поставяха частично запрещение.
Then in 98, my father passed away, and then my stepmother and my half sister decided to
Guardianship.
no, isn't it good of them?
The mother of his sister wanted to take the property in whole hospital.
No,
Then
assisted,
he saw-
sorry. Assisted somebody who knows the word. Sorry, excuse us. So they wanted his property because he hasn't documents for these 2 rooms. They just put him under guardianship in 2000. There were for hearings, and he noted the name of the judge who placed him under guardianship.
След като бях поставен под запрещение, 2 жени, които отговаряха за мене, от община на град после ми вземаха пенсията, която беше малък размер, ми купуваха за 10 лева за ядене всяка седмица и 5 лева да имам отчова си. И аз долу горе преживявах добре, но 2002 година чрез съд му вкараха в психиатрията за 6 месеца.
So when they placed me under guardianship, there was 2 ladies from the municipality who became my guardians. They took my pension. They bought for me food for 10 leva per week and gave me 5 leva per week. My note, it's 10 leva is 5 euro. 5 leva is the half of this. So Rusi says, even that the life was good, enough good, but in 2002 they placed me in psychiatric hospital. By the court, it was obligatory treatment.
На 6 декември 2002 година бях взимат от психиатрията, където бях в задължително лечение и закарвам в Руси. След престои една седмица на 12 декември бях взимат 7 часа сутринта и бях закарал в Гръцкия манастир без мое съгласие дом за възрастни психични разстройства в село Пастора. като са настрани, в дом за психично болни. Много лоши бяха условията и
in that home, the conditions were terrible.
И трудно да търся работа някъде, с което да установя контакт с здрави хора, нормални хора, за да мога да общувам с тях, да мога да пия кафе, да работя.
In that conditions, I started to think about normal people around, where I can work and drink coffee.
Държаха ме без пари в дома.
Because in the home I didn't receive anything.
И това останах с убеждение, че след престояне за 8 години там, много лоша хигиена и битови условия, починаха 32 човека от тая работа и след няколко лекарства и лоши условия.
We are 106 people there. The hygiene was very low. There 36 people died for this period. I spent there 8 years.
Благодарение на NBC телевизията и Америка се застъпнаха за мен и излязох на свобода, те да се каже, но още не ми дигнато запрещение.
Thanks to Methodist Spiritual Center, television and Aneta, I'm free now, but I'm still under guardianship.
Сега съм в по-добри условия, в по-малък град Пазарджик, близо до град София, столицата на България. Чувствам се добре, разположен се в града и там, където живея на центъра на града Попълчане.
Now I'm living in a small town and I can walk and I live well.
Благодаря, че ме изслушахте, дами и господа, и пожелавам на вашите адвокати те да защитават вашите граждани, както в България защитават правото на човека, те във вашата държава да защитават и да уважават психично болните, не да ги поставят по запрещение и да ги цикат по психиатри, но да им помагат, да им се чувстват.
Thank you very much for the attention. I wish you to have lawyers that we have in Bulgaria to protect the rights of people with disability and to ensure that people with psychological disability will be not placed under guardianship, but will receive support that they are needing.
Thank you so much. I know giving you this small time can never do justice to the difficult personal journey that you've had to access justice. But we're very grateful that you took the time and trouble to come to Ireland and to tell us the story in your own words.
Я благодаря много, че ме изчекала от вашите съграждани.
Thank you very much.
And thank you to Aneta as well. So our next speaker is the Honourable Flynn. Kirsten Flynn has been a trial and appellate court judge, a legal educator and a human rights activist for half a century. She's recently retired probate judge in New York City, where she had jurisdiction over guardianships of persons with intellectual and developmental disability. She's written groundbreaking, widely cited decisions on the human rights of legal capacity. And again, that's the abridged version.
Thank you. It's really hard to follow these two amazing people who are my heroes, and also with the gratitude of the wonderful work of the Bulgarian lawyers and activists whom I have learned so much. So thank you. I'm the bad guy on the law, who everyone has to deal with. And fortunately, I was just asked to sort of tell my story. I'm not going to enlighten you about all the things that Gábor has done. But my story, I would frame my story in two ways: as a conversion, so this hopefully will be useful to you, and also as a paradigm shift. And as you've already heard, I was the probate judge in New York after a decade of being the dean of our public interest law school in the city of New York. And there are actually quite a few people connected to this conference from the city of New York. It's sort of interesting. So besides wills and trusts, as you've heard, I had jurisdiction over guardianship over persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And we have a pretty bad statute in New York in terms of the procedural protections that are available. And because I had been involved in reform of our adult guardianship statute some years before, when I became a surrogate, I was very interested in how we might change the law that I was operating under. But I have to admit that it never occurred to me, this was 10 years ago, but it had never occurred to me that there was something deeply wrong with the entire guardianship enterprise. So one day I received a call from a student at my former law school asking if she could come and talk to me about what she understood were my efforts to reform the guardianship law. Of course I said yes, but when she arrived I was somewhat taken aback because she immediately informed me that I was totally on the wrong track. That indeed, instead of reforming guardianship for people with intellectual disabilities, it should be abolished altogether, and that every person, regardless of their disability, had a right to make his or her own decisions. So I asked her first, where did you get this crazy idea from? And second, excuse me, do you have any idea of how impaired the people I see are? That they could make their own decisions? Is that possible? And she answered first that it was a human right guaranteed by the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, which you probably have spoken about, CRPD. And also, yes, that she had a sibling with a severe disability and that she knew many similar people. And that with adequate supports, they all could and should be able to make their own decisions without the state imposing guardianship on them. So I have to admit that it took me a long time after that to process what she had told me, to read and to learn about the convention and supported decision making, and to begin to entertain the possibility that she was really onto something. So I'll skip about a year of that process, but say that at least at an intellectual level, I was coming around to understanding the human rights lens. And during that time, I had the great good fortune of connecting with two people whose name may be known to some of you, Michael Bach and Kersner from Toronto, who've been working on legal capacity for many years. And in the course of our conversations, I concluded that it might be worth thinking about supported decision-making as a less restrictive alternative to guardianship, which at least our statute in New York and most U.S. statutes require. And then I realized that I actually had the perfect case in my court. A few years earlier, I granted guardianship over a young woman with a fairly severe intellectual disability named Gemma's at a time that she was very pregnant with her first child, and her mother and her new husband were fighting about who was going to control the situation. She barely spoke, she couldn't read or write, she couldn't use public transportation, which in New York is a very big thing that we care about in terms of people's ability to take care of themselves. It was a very charged and contested situation because there was some concern that when she went to the hospital, the Child Protective Services Agency might take the baby away from her. So over time, I, of course, stayed involved, and over the next 2 years, this young family experienced many of the problems that are endemic to poor people in our city, including eviction from the apartment they were staying in, and a time in a homeless shelter. Towards the end of my term as surrogate, I became, according to the law, too old to serve, so we discriminated on many grounds. The husband, Alberto, came to court seeking permission to relocate to a nearby state, Pennsylvania, where he had some family, and he thought that it might be possible to make a better life. So I held a series of hearings over 2 months, in which that I discovered that over this sort of 2-year period, with the assistance of social services in New York that they provided to Damaris in terms of learning to care for her daughter, the people that they met in Pennsylvania while they visited, the family that Alberto had there, the wonderful next-door neighbors that they were about to have, that in fact there was this whole support network for Damaris, and that she was actually making decisions for herself and her little girl, and that they were being respected and honored in her new community. In fact, it was a medical procedure that she wanted, and the local medical provider in Pennsylvania wouldn't let Alberta lose her guard, except they insisted that she said that she wanted to do it. So I thought, this is really amazing. It was my first kind of aha moment. Here was supported decision-making for a person that I had thought needed a guardianship, and it was working. I ended up removing the guardian and writing a decision that's been written about and talked about quite a lot and helpful, I hope, to many of you. And in that decision, I included reference to the CRPD, and I relied on the CRPD and the human right. But that experience with Damaris also led me to an entirely new way of both thinking and seeing. And it's this different way of seeing that I refer to as the paradigm shift. So I know many of you know Gerard Quinn, and he said in a talk that I was privileged to be at, where I've read, that if he ever heard another person say paradigm shift, he would throw up. So I'm always cautious about using it. But when you go back to the original meaning of the term, it's really quite useful. It comes from a book called The Origins of Scientific Revolution, which was written by a man named Thomas Kuhn. And what he talks about is how when a group of experts or people, a community of knowledge, sees a body of evidence that they've looked at and they understand and they get it, and then suddenly they look at it in a different way. And it changes. And not only the way they look at it, but the way they look at the world completely shifts. And that's really what happened to me, and that's what has to happen for legal policy to become reality. In the readings, conversations, the Damaris case itself, I literally began to see the people who were appearing in front of me with different eyes. I'm not just talking about high-functioning people on the autism spectrum, but individuals with very severe disabilities, with severe cerebral palsy, people in chairs, on gurneys, who didn't talk, who couldn't do activities of daily living. But I began to see how they communicated with their caregivers or their parents, and how they expressed their will and preference, and how their parents and caregivers were able to translate that for me and for other people. And so the paradigm shift for me, seeing these beautiful and brave, young, and not always so young people, and their loving caregivers, was literally to flip the inquiry that I was making as a judge from what can't these people do to what would it take to make it possible for them to convey and have their decisions recognized. I also started to recognize and think about guardianship quite differently. I was at a talk on land takings by an African-American lawyer and activist who relayed an experience that she had had in South Africa. She was speaking to an elderly man who had lived in a poor community there during the time of apartheid, when the government condemned the community and ordered the land cleared. And she described his reaction as he saw his modest home bulldozed and destroyed. She said, there are two kinds of taking. The thief can take stuff, and that's a loss. But it's only stuff, it's only property. But when someone takes away your history, part of who you are, that's a different kind of taking. That's a dignity taking. So I think one of the really beautiful things about human rights, whether in the original Universal Declaration of Human Rights back in 1948 or in the CRP, which applies those rights to vulnerable populations, is that one of its core values is human dignity. So another part of my paradigm shift was to understand that guardianship is not a kindly, protective, although somewhat paternalistic process, but rather what it really is, which is a profound dignity-taking. The paradigm shift that I'm talking about is literally about changing the way we see, which is one of the reasons I became an obsessive advocate for pilot projects, to demonstrate to the doubting how very much people with intellectual disabilities can with supports too. When I've spoken to my colleagues on the bench, I'm usually met with at best disbelief, more often disdain. But one of my colleagues and friends, Mark Rita, wrote this to ours in Brooklyn, which is the Brooklyn of the movie that's now making Ireland so trendy in the States, started looking at a different way and writing wonderful decisions, including the decisions about the right to marry for people with profound disabilities. And so I see that it's happening. So the more examples that we can show, especially the more stories that we can tell, the sooner this necessary paradigm shift will happen in the legal world and in society as a whole. It's why we need well-constructed and well-evaluated pilot projects like the one in Bulgaria, and hopefully one I'll be heading up in New York, and why we need voices and the wonderful work which this organization is engaged in. I'm honored to be here and to be part of it. And I also want to tell you at the end of my story that the audacious and articulate law student who literally changed my life is one of my heroes, another of my heroes, responsible for us being here today, who you'll be hearing from later, Dr. Anna Arstein Herzlich. So thank you to her and to the Voices Project for coming.
Thank you so much for talking us through your conversion, as you put it. And yes, I think we all will be down to hear later on.